Hey Fellowship Kids team, Autumn here to talk to you about the lesson we'll be teaching in our Fellowship Kids classes this coming Sunday, October 27th. We are in Story 8 of the Biggest Story curriculum, and this week's lesson is titled The Judge Judges Justly, and it is taken from Genesis 18 and 19. In these first few lessons, which have covered from Genesis 1 now to Genesis 19, we have encountered a lot of tough stuff. And so I wanted to talk to you for a moment today about how to handle it in your classroom when you come across a difficult topic. So far in these first 19 chapters of Genesis, we have covered murder, a worldwide flood that wiped out a whole bunch of people, various sexual sins, theft, deception. So, no shortage of sin to talk about and a lot of resulting response from God in various forms of judgment. So, how do you handle it when the passage, like in this week's passage, if you were to read Genesis 18 and 19, before you read through the lesson and read through the Biggest Story Bible storybook, as the curriculum suggests, that first you read through the passage and pray about it. If you read through these passages, you will encounter some pretty serious sinful acts and some hard descriptions that are hard for us as adults to reckon with. And we read about God's judgment. So there's description of various kinds of sexual sins, or inclusion of those in the passage, and discussion of God's judgment. So how do we teach these sorts of things to our children? Well, I have a few things that I'll cover briefly, a few suggestions. So first of all, before we encounter any specific passage in the Bible, we must commit to teaching the whole counsel of God. So we won't ever choose or not choose a passage or decide to teach or not teach a lesson because it contains something difficult. If we believe that the whole of Scripture was given to us by God, then the whole of Scripture is for our good and helps us know God. So first of all, that has to be our commitment headed into any sort of lesson preparation and into any class. We won't avoid the hard parts of Scripture, and we will teach God as He reveals Himself to us, not as we want Him to be, and not according to our 2024 American sensibilities. So that's the first. That's our commitment. Then the second suggestion is when you encounter hard passages, commit to teaching the whole counsel of God, so not to telling our kids anything that is untrue. However, we also want to teach our lessons in an age-appropriate way and to put them in language that is contextualized to our children. Another way of saying this is that we don't need to offer more detail than is warranted for your specific class. So you may encounter something like in this week's passage about the men of Sodom knocking on Lot's door and asking for them to be able to sleep with, to have sexual relations with the men who they knew were his visitors. We do not need to cover the particulars of everything that is entailed in that passage with our children. That said, we do also have to be prepared to address questions that may arise. Now, our curriculum, I think thus far in all of our lessons, handles this in a very good way. So focuses on the big theological truths, helps us have language that we can use to talk about these passages and to point us towards God's promises and towards God's faithfulness over and over. And those need to be our big takeaways. The curriculum also helps us deal with the reality of sin and God's judgment. And yet, anytime you're taking on one of these stories, we need to be prepared to answer questions that may arise. So, don't offer more detail than what is needed, and it's okay to say, that is such a good question, and that's not something we can discuss in class today, because that's not the point of our lesson. The third suggestion that I have is be straightforward, not strange or dodgy. If you act that way in response to a difficult question or a difficult passage, our kids will get the sense that this is something we shouldn't talk about, or we don't know quite how to handle the fact that Scripture talks about it. And so answer simply, answer in a straightforward way. Sometimes that requires preparation ahead of time, like anticipating questions. So to our lesson this week, one question that I might anticipate is, why did God turn Lot's wife into a pillar of salt? We can consult different tools like commentaries and see what different theological scholars think. However, the honest answer is, from this text, we simply don't know. God does not explain why that is his method of judgment on Lot's wife in this particular passage. And if we think about our past few stories and the ways that God's judgment has taken shape, or what forms it has taken, well, we've seen that Adam and Eve were removed from God's presence as a result of their sin. We saw the flood as a means of God's judgment. That's one way his judgment took shape. In the story of the Tower of Babel, God scattered people and mixed up the languages. In this story, God rains down fire and sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt. So God's judgment in the stories that we have covered takes many different forms. And this passage doesn't tell us why she is turned into a pillar of salt, or petrified, as some texts say. So it would be fine to say in response to that question, that is such a good question. I wonder that too. That's not something God tells us in the Bible. But God did tell us a lot of other things in this passage, and shift the focus back to that. So, for instance, in last week's lesson, we talked about circumcision. I'm going to use this quickly as an example of how to take on something hard in your classes. So, our lesson last week did a great job of saying circumcision was a sign of God's promise, a sign of the covenant, which it is. So, that is a true statement, and it is simple and straightforward and maybe sufficient for the majority of our students. You, as an adult, could think through it something like this. The promised son, Isaac, would come through a sexual act between Abraham and Sarah. That was a part of what was anticipated in the promise. A son would be born. Abraham and Sarah doubted, and they tried to arrange a way for this to happen outside of God's law and God's promise through a different sexual act of Abraham with Hagar. And then circumcision after that was God's judgment in a real physical sense, and grace, all in one sign. It was a reminder that God would accomplish his will in his way. So, then how might you answer this question? Well, what is circumcision? If it came up in your classes last week, or might come up again. The Bible talks about circumcision a lot. So you could say to a class, for instance, of 4th and 5th graders who have an understanding of anatomy and probably some concept of sexual acts at this point, you might say to them, well, circumcision was a sign. It seems unusual to us, but God gave us signs for other covenants too, like he gave Noah the sign of the covenant, setting a rainbow in the sky. This was a physical reminder, like a rainbow was a reminder in the physical world of God's seal on that covenant. Circumcision was a reminder of God's seal on this covenant with Abraham. So you could explain that, and you could simply say, if a 4th or 5th grader asked you what is circumcision, you could say it involved removing a piece of skin from a man's penis, and that seems really weird to us and something that we wouldn't usually talk about in class, but the Bible talks about it. And it reminded Abraham and then all the generations of Israelites after that their whole bodies were to be given to God and consecrated to God. There was no part of them that wasn't to be submitted to God's will, and to remind them of God's promise that he would bring about his plan in his way. So that's a way you could answer that question, for instance. Now, I know this is getting lengthy, but let's talk for just a moment about this thread that has run through all of our lessons before this and is true in this lesson as well. So we've been talking a lot about God's promise, about sin, the sin of the people who God created, and God's judgment. And those are threads that run through all of these last lessons. They run through our story of Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, the story of Babel, Abraham and Sarah, and now in this week's story about Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his family and his wife. So we set that context by following this pattern in the lesson that goes this way. Every week, they ask us to talk about the big picture. The big picture reminds us where we've been in the biblical story to this point. And then we teach or tell the story, and that reminds us where we are in the timeline of the big story in today's lesson. And then it concludes with a gospel. Our lesson time concludes with this gospel connection, and that helps us see where the story that we talked about today is going, where it points us towards Jesus or is fulfilled in Jesus. And I think that the concept in today's lesson about God being a just judge and saying he would spare Sodom for 10 righteous people. Remember, righteous is being in right relationship with God and living in right relationship and loving appropriately others around us. And God was not able to find 10 righteous people, so 10 people who lived in right relationship with God and others in Sodom. And I love this point in the curriculum, right at the end of Teach the Story, that says, Abraham saw God keep his promise to destroy the cities. He was reminded that God always keeps his promises, even his promise to judge the wicked. So we've been talking about the promise, the covenant that God gave to Abraham and Sarah. This is a good promise, but God had also promised to judge sin, which we see displayed for us in this story. And yet it reminds us that God always keeps his promises. And so this week's big truth is that God is the judge who judges justly, which is a great takeaway from this passage for us and our students.